How do we really know the people closest to us? The ones who share our homes, our dinners, and our quiet nights? For Eleanor Hayes, that question would come to define the final chapter of her life. At 67, Eleanor was a woman who had built everything from nothing: a name, a business, and a sense of dignity carved from years of loss and perseverance. Her life was proof that strength could be elegant, that grace could be forged through pain. But behind the polished veneer of success, Eleanor's greatest weakness was the same thing that once made her strong: her unshakable faith in love and family. Eleanor grew up in a small, working-class town where survival meant sacrifice. Her parents ran a modest hardware store that barely stayed afloat. From them, she learned the value of hard work and the weight of self-reliance. If you want something done right, her mother used to say, "You do it yourself." Those words would follow Eleanor for the rest of her life. In her 20s, she married Michael Hayes, a young contractor with big dreams and kind eyes. Together, they scraped through the early years, living in small apartments, counting pennies, dreaming about a home they could one day call their own. When their daughter, Lila, was born, Eleanor promised herself she'd give the child everything she never had: stability, education, opportunity. But life, as always, had other plans. When Michael died unexpectedly in a car accident, Eleanor was only 35. The world seemed to collapse overnight. She had a daughter in middle school, a mortgage, and no one to fall back on. Many women would have broken. Eleanor refused. She took the insurance payout, meager as it was, and reinvented herself. Real estate became her new battlefield. She started as an assistant, then as an agent, then as the woman who could sell any home in the county. Clients trusted her. Colleagues envied her. They called her the Steel Magnolia: polite, beautiful, but impossible to bend. Within a decade, Eleanor was running her own boutique real estate agency out of the very building she once cleaned after hours. To those who met her, Eleanor was a picture of composure. She dressed in muted tones, favored pearls over diamonds, and always spoke with deliberate calm. But those who knew her best, few as they were, understood that beneath that calm exterior was a woman still haunted by loneliness. Her daughter Lila had grown into a striking young woman, confident, fashionable, and restless, but the bond between them had grown thin. Lila often accused her mother of being controlling, while Eleanor saw her daughter as entitled and ungrateful. The argument started small, about money, career choices, boyfriends, but each one left deeper scars. Still, Eleanor loved her fiercely. When Lila wanted to move to the city for college, Eleanor paid for it. When she wanted to open a small boutique that failed within a year, Eleanor quietly covered the debts. Every setback, every bad decision, Eleanor was there to fix it, to protect her only child from the same hunger she once knew. And yet, despite everything she gave, Lila grew more distant. By the time Eleanor reached her mid-60s, her home, a sprawling brick estate on the edge of town, had become her kingdom and her cage. Every room bore traces of her life's work: family photos, real estate awards, old contracts framed like trophies. The house was quiet now, too quiet, the kind of quiet that echoes. On most evenings, she'd sit by the bay window with a glass of wine, watching the lights flicker from the neighboring homes. Families laughing, children shouting, dogs barking, the simple chaos she no longer had. She'd often tell her longtime housekeeper Rosa Martinez, "You know, I built all of this with my hands. Every brick, every nail, and yet somehow I feel like I'm standing outside of it." Rosa, loyal and sharp-eyed, would nod but say little. She'd worked for Eleanor for more than 30 years, seen her rise, fall, and rise again. She was more like a sister than an employee, but even she could sense that something inside Eleanor was shifting. There was a restlessness in her employer's smile, a flicker of longing that no success could fill. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the creeping awareness that love, true love, had eluded her all along. Eleanor would sometimes imagine what life might have been if Michael had lived. Would Lila be happier? Would the house feel warmer? Would she still wake up every morning with that hollow ache behind her ribs. She was not a woman who believed in fairy tales. She'd seen too much of the world to fall for them. But when you've spent decades surviving, there's a part of you that still craves softness, tenderness, a hand to hold. And that part of Eleanor, the one she thought long buried, was about to awaken. Because soon, a man named Victor Hale would walk into her life. He would look her in the eye and say all the right words. He would promise her peace, understanding, and companionship. And Eleanor, against every instinct she'd sharpened over a lifetime, would believe him. She had built everything: her home, her fortune, her independence. But the one thing she hadn't built yet was her downfall. When Victor Hale walked into Eleanor Hayes's life, he carried the kind of charm that could make anyone forget to ask the right questions. He was 53, handsome in a weathered, confident sort of way, with that effortless smile and the smooth cadence of a man who knew how to disarm a room. His hair was streaked with silver, his voice warm but deliberate, and when he looked at you, he made you feel like you were the only person in the world. For a woman who'd spent her entire life being strong for everyone else, that kind of attention was intoxicating. They met at a charity gala downtown, one of those polished, predictable fundraisers where old money and new ambition share the same dance floor. Eleanor had attended out of obligation. She'd donated to the cause, shaken hands with developers, smiled for the cameras. She was ready to leave when Victor appeared beside her at the champagne table. "You look like a woman who hates small talk," he said, tilting his glass toward her. She laughed, something rare these days. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to people who feel the same way," he replied. It was an easy exchange, but it landed. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt seen, not as the successful widow or the polished realtor, but as a woman. They talked for hours, and when he offered to walk her to her car, she said yes. By the end of the week, they were having coffee. By the end of the month, dinners. And within 6 months, Victor Hale was spending more time in Eleanor's house than in his own apartment. To her friends, he seemed perfect, attentive, affectionate, even protective. He'd bring her flowers just because. He'd cook dinner, insisting she rest while he took care of things. He made her laugh, something few people could do anymore. Rosa Martinez, however, wasn't convinced. She had seen many people pass through that house over the years, contractors, clients, even the occasional boyfriend. But none of them had made her skin crawl the way Victor did. It wasn't anything specific. It was the way he seemed to shift his tone depending on who was watching. The way his eyes turned cold when he thought no one noticed. Rosa once caught him in Eleanor's office, going through drawers. He smiled and brushed it off, saying he was looking for a pen. But Rosa didn't believe him. "Be careful with that man," she told Eleanor one afternoon. "He's too smooth, too perfect." Eleanor smiled, dismissing it kindly. "Rosa, you've been watching too many crime shows." But deep down, a part of her hesitated. A part that had learned, through loss and loneliness, to trust her instincts. Yet the loneliness was stronger. Victor had a way of filling silence with something that felt like safety. He told her stories about his past, about a failed marriage, a bankrupt business, and his journey to find peace. He painted himself as a survivor, a man who had made mistakes but had learned from them. He called Eleanor his second chance. What she didn't know was that Victor Hale's entire life was built on second chances, each one stolen from someone else. Years earlier, in Florida, he'd been investigated for convincing a recently widowed woman to sign over her property for legal protection. The property was sold days later, the money vanished, and Victor disappeared before charges could stick. A few years after that, in Tennessee, he reinvented himself as Dr. Victor Hall, a consultant for a senior care charity. When that charity's funds went missing, so did he. By the time he reached Eleanor's town, he perfected the act, confident but humble, mysterious but vulnerable. He knew exactly how to read a woman's heart and rearrange himself to fit it. To Eleanor, he seemed like an answer to prayers whispered too late. Their romance moved quickly, though Eleanor told herself it was fine. After all, hadn't she earned the right to happiness? Victor made her feel young again. He was spontaneous, picnics by the lake, weekend trips to wine country. Handwritten notes slipped in her purse. He called her Ellie, a name only her late husband used. That should have been a warning. Instead, she took it as a sign. Even Lila, her daughter, was charmed. When she came to visit, Victor made her laugh, complimented her, and called her bright like her mother. The tension between mother and daughter seemed to soften, and Eleanor was grateful, too grateful to see what was really happening. Behind closed doors, Victor was already working on his next reinvention. He learned Eleanor's finances. He found her insurance documents, her property deeds, her safe. Slowly, quietly, he became indispensable, the man who handled everything. The transformation was seamless. He'd go from holding her hand at dinner to checking her passwords at midnight. And though Rose's eyes followed him with quiet suspicion, Victor always smiled as if nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. Still, every con has one weakness: time. As the months passed, small cracks appeared in the illusion. A story that didn't add up, a bank call that he intercepted, a flash of temper when questioned too closely. Eleanor noticed, but she wanted to believe. She told herself that love was about patience, about forgiveness, that everyone carried secrets. What she didn't realize was that his secret would destroy everything she'd built. Because Victor Hale wasn't just after companionship. He was after control over her life, her home, and eventually her death. Every story of betrayal begins with a fracture, a hairline crack that no one notices until it's too late. For Eleanor Hayes, that fracture was her daughter. Lila Carter had grown up with every advantage her mother never had: private schools, designer clothes, summers abroad, a trust fund waiting for her 30th birthday. On paper, she was the perfect reflection of Eleanor's success: elegant, educated, and confident. But in reality, she was the embodiment of everything Eleanor feared success would breed: entitlement, resentment, and distance. Their relationship had always been complicated. Eleanor saw discipline as love. Lila saw it as control. When Eleanor said, "I only push you because I want the best for you," Lila heard, "You're never good enough." For years, they circled each other like strangers sharing a house built from old arguments. When Victor Hale entered the picture, he found that crack and widened it with surgical precision. He knew how to read people, especially women who wanted to be understood. Lila fascinated him. She had her mother's beauty, but none of her restraint. She was impulsive, dramatic, and hungry for attention. Where Eleanor carried her pain quietly, Lila demanded to be seen, to be validated. Victor saw that need, and he fed it. At first, it was harmless. Compliments that slipped easily into conversation. "You have your mother's eyes, but they're softer. You've got a spark that she lost years ago." He'd make her laugh, tell stories about his so-called wild younger days, and listen to her vent about her mother's high standards. "She means well," Victor would say, leaning closer, "but she doesn't really see you, does she?" It was exactly what Lila had always wanted someone to say. Soon, her visits to the house became longer. She'd arrive for dinner and stay overnight, spending hours in the kitchen with Victor while Eleanor worked in her office upstairs. Their friendship grew behind Eleanor's back, a secret wrapped in the illusion of family harmony. Lila told herself it was innocent. Victor was charming, attentive, and kind in ways her mother hadn't been in years. He listened. He asked questions no one else asked. And when he looked at her, she felt like the center of someone's universe. It didn't take long for admiration to turn into something else. Eleanor noticed the shift, but not the source. She simply saw her daughter smiling more, laughing again, showing a warmth she hadn't seen in years. She thought, perhaps foolishly, that Victor was healing the tension between them. She couldn't have been more wrong. Behind the laughter and polite dinners, a forbidden bond was taking root. Lila began to crave Victor's approval as much as she resented her mother's. He blurred the lines slowly, a touch on her hand that lingered, a whispered joke too intimate, a glance that carried meaning no father figure should ever give. For Victor, it wasn't love. It was leverage. For Lila, it was escape. Her entire life, she had been measured against Eleanor's perfection. Victor made her feel imperfectly beautiful, human, flawed, and adored. She began to confide in him, revealing childhood insecurities, her failures, the resentment she carried like armor. And Victor, always patient, always strategic, used every confession as another tool in his quiet manipulation. She wants to control everything, Lila said one night after too much wine. Victor smiled softly. Even your happiness. He leaned in, his tone low and intimate. You deserve to be free, Lila. To live life your way, not under her shadow. Freedom. That word struck her like gospel. From that night on, Lila began to see her mother not as the woman who sacrificed everything for her, but as the obstacle standing between her and the life she thought she deserved. She started taking Victor's side in small arguments, defending him when Eleanor questioned his decisions. The once fragile bond between mother and daughter finally began to splinter for good. Rosa Martinez noticed it too, the strange energy that filled the house. The way Lila's eyes followed Victor when she thought no one was looking. The tension in Eleanor's voice when she spoke about her daughter's sudden affection for him. It was subtle, but it was there, the slow erosion of trust inside a home built on it. Eleanor believed she was finally seeing her family come together again. But in truth, the two people she loved most were already conspiring. Not with words, not yet with plans, but with silence and stolen glances. That's how betrayal always begins. In quiet rooms, in shared secrets, in the comforting lie that this, whatever this is, doesn't really hurt anyone. And while Eleanor continued to dream of peace, Victor and Lila were already building something else entirely, something that would destroy her. It began on a night that felt like any other. The air outside Eleanor Hayes' estate was still and heavy, the kind of quiet that settles over the suburbs after midnight, when everything looks peaceful and nothing truly is. She had gone to bed early that evening. Her head ached, the same dull, persistent throb that had plagued her for weeks. Victor had made her tea, kissed her forehead, and said, "Rest, Ellie. You work too hard." She smiled faintly, unaware that even small acts of care can sometimes hide the deepest deceit. Sometime after midnight, Eleanor awoke. It wasn't a sound that startled her awake. Not exactly. It was a feeling, a shift in the air, a faint vibration in her chest that whispered something's wrong. She sat up, listening. The house was supposed to be silent, but faintly, just barely, she heard laughter. A woman's laughter. Familiar. Light. Then a man's voice, lower, smoother. She reached for her robe and stepped quietly into the hall. The laughter grew clearer as she descended the stairs, echoing faintly from the kitchen. She paused at the end of the hallway, pressing her hand against the wall for balance. Her daughter Lila was supposed to have gone home hours ago. Victor, too, had said he was heading to the study to read. But now, their voices intertwined in a melody of intimacy that made Eleanor's skin prickle. Her bare feet barely made a sound as she moved closer. The kitchen light was dim, just a soft glow spilling across the floor. She stopped before the doorway, her heart hammering. Through the narrow gap between the wall and the doorframe, she saw them. Lila, leaning against the counter, smiling. Her hair fell over her shoulder, her expression soft, almost adoring. Victor standing close. Too close. His hand brushed her back as he whispered something that made her giggle. She didn't step away. The space between them pulsed with something that wasn't familial. It was electric. Wrong. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't even think. Her heart, steady and disciplined for decades, suddenly felt like a stranger in her chest. She wanted to speak, to scream, to shatter the illusion right there in her kitchen. But her body wouldn't obey. Instead, she turned and stepped back into the dark hallway, her hand trembling against the wall. The world around her blurred. Every sound, every shadow, as if her home itself had turned against her. She climbed the stairs one careful step at a time, each one heavier than the last. When she reached her bedroom, she closed the door softly behind her and leaned against it, trying to breathe. There were no tears, not yet, only silence. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the photo on her dresser. a younger version of herself, holding baby Lila in her arms, both smiling at the camera. The frame shimmered in the moonlight, mocking her. She whispered, "How could you?" But even she wasn't sure to whom she was speaking. In that single night, everything she'd built, the life, the legacy, the idea of family, cracked like thin glass. The next morning, she called Rosa Martinez to her room. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were hollow. "Rosa," she said, "I need you to tell me the truth. Have you noticed anything between them? Anything inappropriate?" Rosa hesitated. Years of loyalty warred with fear. "I've seen things, ma'am. I can't say for certain, but something isn't right." Eleanor nodded slowly, her jaw tightening. "Then I'm not imagining it." She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the manicured garden below, the same garden where she once watched Lila play as a child. "If what I saw last night is true," she whispered, "I'm not angry. I'm grieving. Grieving the family I thought I had." From that day forward, something inside her changed. She moved through the house with the quiet resolve of someone who knew the truth but refused to give it power. She smiled at breakfast, listened to Victor's stories, even asked about Lila's boutique. But behind every polite nod, a plan was forming, not out of vengeance, but of survival. At night, when the lights went out, she would sit awake and replay that image. Victor's hand on her daughter's back, Lila's laughter, the betrayal that lived in the space between them. Each replay hardened her resolve. Eleanor Hayes had built her life from ashes before. She could do it again, but this time she would build her justice in silence. Because some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be seen, remembered, and avenged in their own time. And while Victor and Lila carried on their secret affair onto the same roof, believing Eleanor to be blind, she was quietly preparing for the day they would both realize how wrong they were. The night of discovery had broken her heart, but had also awakened her will, and that in time would be the very thing that destroyed them. The days after that night felt like a waking dream. Eleanor Hayes moved through her home like a ghost, polite smiles, gentle words, perfectly folded routines, but inside, she was unraveling. The laughter that once filled her kitchen now echoed in her mind like a cruel reminder. She had caught them, her daughter and her lover. But rather than explode in rage, Eleanor did something far more dangerous. She stayed silent. To Victor Hale and Lila Carter, that silence was permission. They believed she was slipping, distracted, perhaps getting forgetful with age. It made their lives easier, their plans smoother. But in truth, Eleanor's mind had never been sharper. She had lived her entire life reading people, negotiating, predicting human behavior. Now, she was reading them, watching, waiting, and something about her body, the strange fatigue, the dizziness, the nausea, began to make sense. At first, she blamed stress, then maybe grief. But the symptoms didn't fade, they deepened. Her skin turned pale, her hands trembled, her appetite disappeared. Every morning, Victor brought her a cup of tea. Chamomile, he'd said, good for the nerves. He was gentle, attentive, always smiling as he handed her the porcelain cup. And every morning, she drank it. Until one day, she didn't. She waited until Victor left the room, then quietly poured the tea into the sink. The liquid left a faint ring around the drain, oily, unnatural. That's when the first real chill crawled down her spine. That evening, she called Rosa Martinez to her study. "Rosa," she said, her voice calm but low, "has Victor ever made tea for you?" Rosa frowned. "Once or twice, ma'am." "Why?" Eleanor hesitated, then met her eyes. "Because I think my husband might be trying to kill me." The words hung in the air like smoke. Rosa didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice trembled. "You think he's poisoning you?" "I don't think," Eleanor whispered. "I know." From that moment on, Rosa became her quiet ally. She watched closely what Victor cooked, what Lila served, what bottles went missing from the kitchen cabinet. And she noticed something chilling. On the days Eleanor drank the tea, she could barely stand. On the days she didn't, she seemed almost normal. But proof was hard to find. Victor was meticulous, too careful to leave evidence. too skilled at charm to draw suspicion. Even Lila played her part perfectly, hovering over her mother with performative concern. "Mom, you need to rest," she'd say, brushing Eleanor's hair back. "You're overworking yourself again." The affection felt counterfeit, but Eleanor endured it. She smiled through it. She knew that every act of false care was bringing her closer to the truth. And one morning, when Victor and Lila left for the gym, she made her move. Eleanor drove herself, weak and trembling, to her attorney's office downtown. She sat across from him, her posture regal despite the fatigue that radiated through her bones. "I need to make a change," she said. The attorney nodded. "To your will?" "No," she replied softly. "To my life insurance policy." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. Within an hour, the paperwork was complete. The $1.7 million that had once been designated for Victor Hale was now assigned to a new beneficiary, Rosa Martinez, her housekeeper and lifelong confidant. As she signed her name, Eleanor felt a rare calm settle over her. She had just taken back control, not of her life, perhaps, but of her legacy. When she returned home, Victor greeted her with his usual warmth. "Feeling better, sweetheart?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "Much better," she said, and for the first time it wasn't a lie. That night, she accepted his tea again, drank it fully, smiling across the table as he watched. To him, it was victory. To her, it was confirmation. Later, she confided in Rosa, whispering words that would one day become her epitaph. "If they want my death, then I'll give them a death worth remembering. I'll let them think they've won, right up until they lose everything." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's health continued to decline. Her hands grew frail, her body weaker. But her mind remained fierce, calculating, deliberate, unbroken. Victor mistook her quietness for surrender. Lila mistook it for forgiveness. But Rosa knew better. She saw the resolve in Eleanor's eyes, the kind that comes only from someone who's decided how the story will end. Eleanor Hayes had spent her entire life building homes, wealth, family, love. Now she was building something else, her own justice. And as the poison worked its slow, merciless path through her veins, Eleanor ensured that the real toxin, greed, would soon destroy the very people who had served it to her. The end came quietly, not with screams or chaos, but with the kind of stillness that feels almost merciful. When Eleanor Hayes died, the world believed it was natural. A graceful passing, they said. 70 years old, a lifetime of stress, and a body finally giving out. But Rosa Martinez knew better. She'd watched the slow decline, the way Eleanor's skin lost its color, the trembling in her hands, the fog in her eyes. It wasn't age. It was something darker, something that had crept in her body drop by drop, cup by cup. The morning Eleanor passed, Victor Hale called 911 in a performance worthy of an actor. His voice shook just enough to sound convincing. "My wife, she's not breathing." When paramedics arrived, Eleanor was already gone. Victor held her hand, tears glistening in his eyes. Lila Carter stood by the doorway, pale but emotionless, as if rehearsing grief rather than feeling it. The death certificate listed it as organ failure due to natural causes. No autopsy was ordered. Victor arranged a beautiful funeral, white roses, gospel music, and a eulogy filled with lies. "She was the love of my life," he said, his voice trembling. "A woman who gave everything and asked for nothing." Rosa stood in the back pew, hands clenched, jaw tight. She'd heard those words before, the same rehearsed sentiment Victor used on everyone. She watched as he placed his hand over Lila's, lingering just a second too long, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. Something inside Rosa snapped. She didn't cry that day. She made a vow. After the funeral, the house was eerily quiet. The scent of lilies mixed with the faint smell of chamomile, Eleanor's favorite tea, now forever tainted. Rosa moved through the kitchen, collecting mugs, wiping counters, noticing how Victor and Lila avoided her gaze. They thought it was over. They thought they'd won. But fate, and Eleanor's foresight, had other plans. A few weeks later, Victor went to claim the life insurance policy. He smiled through the paperwork, certain he was about to collect the reward for his patience and deceit. When the agent read the beneficiary aloud, his confidence cracked. Beneficiary, Rosa Martinez. He blinked, the words not registering. That's impossible. There must be a mistake. There's no mistake, the agent said. The change was made 2 months before Mrs. Hayes' passing. For a moment, Victor's mask slipped. The charm evaporated, replaced by something cold and feral. But he quickly recovered, smiling weakly. Of course, she must have done it out of gratitude. He left the office in silence, but his hand shook on the steering wheel all the way home. That same night, Rosa received a call from the county coroner. The insurance company had requested a routine review, which meant an examination of the original medical records. The toxicologist noticed something strange: elevated levels of chemical compounds not typically found in natural deaths. It was enough to raise suspicion, and enough for authorities to order a full toxicology test. The results were damning. Traces of ethylene glycol, a toxic compound found in antifreeze, were discovered in Eleanor's bloodstream. Administered in small, diluted doses over several months, it mimicked the symptoms of chronic illness. This was no natural death. It was murder. Detectives arrived at the Hayes residence 2 days later. They questioned Victor and Lila separately. Victor played the grieving husband, composed, helpful, even charming. Lila, however, cracked under pressure. When asked about the tea, she froze. When confronted with the toxicology results, she stammered. I don't know. Victor handled all that. The cracks began to widen. Detectives searched the home and found receipts for cleaning supplies and over-the-counter medications, all purchased under Lila's name, but paid for with Victor's card. They also discovered several text messages between the two. Most were romantic, but some carried a more chilling tone. Patience, my love. Soon, everything will be ours. Don't lose your nerve now. 1 more month. When Detective Morrison confronted Lila with the messages, she broke. Tears streamed down her face as the truth spilled out. I didn't mean to hurt her, she cried. He told me it was safe, that it would just make her sick, not kill her. She confessed to slipping the poison into Eleanor's tea, acting under Victor's direction. He said we could finally be together after she was gone, that the money would take care of everything. The confession shattered the facade completely. Victor was arrested the next morning, still in bed, his face blank as officers handcuffed him. Rosa stood outside the gate and watched. She didn't speak, just whispered, "Justice, Eleanor. Justice." In the weeks that followed, the story became a national headline. The widow who outsmarted her killers. Journalists unearthed Victor's history of fraud, the trail of women he'd manipulated across several states. But this time, he had chosen the wrong woman. Eleanor Hayes hadn't just died. She'd orchestrated her own posthumous justice. By changing her insurance policy, she ensured her killers gained nothing but handcuffs and headlines. And through Rosa, she left behind a legacy that could not be stolen. As one investigator later said, Eleanor may have died quietly, but she screamed the truth from her grave. The courthouse in downtown Briarfield had seen its share of scandals, corruption cases, violent crimes, messy divorces, but never anything quite like this. The murder of Eleanor Hayes wasn't just a crime. It was a story that forced an entire community to question what trust really meant. By the time Victor Hale and Lila Carter walked into court, their faces were already infamous. The tabloids called them the Poison Hearts. Talk shows dissected their affair. Journalists speculated endlessly about motives, about money, about the psychology of betrayal. But inside that courtroom, beneath the heavy air of silence, there were no headlines. Only two people sitting side by side, once bound by desire, now chained by guilt. Victor arrived in a dark suit, perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable. Even in disgrace, he carried himself with that same predatory composure that had once fooled everyone. Lila, by contrast, looked hollow. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Her hands trembled as she clutched a tissue. The spark that once drew Victor to her had long burned out. The trial began with prosecutor Ellen Parks, a woman known for her precision and composure. She opened with words that froze the room. This case is not about passion. It's about greed. It's about two people who decided that money and lust were worth more than a human life, a mother's life. The prosecution laid out the timeline, months of manipulation, the affair, the poison, the altered insurance policy that derailed their plan. The jury listened in stunned silence as forensic experts described the methodical nature of Eleanor's murder. Ethylene glycol administered in tea over several months, mimicking illness until her body shut down. The evidence was overwhelming. The toxicology reports, the financial transactions, the text messages between Victor and Lila, coded but damning. Then came the witness who would turn the tide completely, Rosa Martinez. When Rosa took the stand, the entire courtroom shifted. She was composed but trembling, dressed modestly in black. The jurors leaned forward as she began to speak. She told them about her 30 years with Eleanor, about the long nights, the shared laughter, the loyalty that bound them beyond the roles of employer and employee. And then, her voice breaking just slightly, she described the change she'd seen in the house, the unease, the lies, the tea. She told me she thought she was being poisoned, Rosa said quietly. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted to protect what was left of her life. So she changed her policy, not to hurt them, but to stop them. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of pens scratching across notepads. Then the prosecution played Lila's recorded confession, the one she gave during interrogation. The audio filled the room, a young woman's trembling voice soaked in guilt. "He told me to do it," she said on the recording. "He said if she died, we could finally be free. I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted him to love me." Lila covered her face and sobbed as the words played. The jurors watched her, some with pity, others with visible disgust. Victor, meanwhile, sat motionless, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on nothing. When it was his turn to take the stand, his performance began. He denied everything, claimed Lila was unstable, claimed Eleanor had changed the policy out of spite, not foresight. "She was sick," he said coldly. "We all knew she was dying. I tried to take care of her. If she wanted to destroy me in the end, that's on her." But the evidence didn't lie, and neither did the witnesses. Detective Morrison took the stand next, detailing the forensic trail that tied Victor directly to the purchases of antifreeze, the deleted messages from his phone, and the digital evidence showing he'd searched symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning weeks before Eleanor's death. By the time the defense rested, it was clear there would be no redemption here. During closing arguments, Prosecutor Parks faced the jury and said, "Eleanor Hayes spent her life building a home, a family, a future, and the two people she trusted most dismantled all of it. But even as they plotted her death, she found a way to outsmart them. Her silence was not weakness. It was strength, the kind that speaks long after life is gone." When the jury retired for deliberation, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Hours passed like days. Then, finally, the doors opened. The foreman stood. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Victor Hale, guilty." A wave of emotion swept through the room. Gasps, muffled sobs, even a few claps before the judge silenced them. Moments later, the second verdict was read. "On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant, Lila Carter, guilty." Lila broke down completely, collapsing into tears as deputies moved toward her. Victor didn't move. He simply stared straight ahead, his face carved from stone. The sentencing was swift. Victor Hale, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lila Carter, life imprisonment with the chance of parole after 25 years. When the judge asked if either had anything to say, Lila whispered through her tears, "I'm sorry, Mom." Victor said nothing. As they were let out in handcuffs, Rosa exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. She clutched a small pendant Eleanor had given her years earlier, a tiny gold locket with the words, "Do right, even when no one sees." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, and headlines exploded across the country. The widow who outsmarted her killers. Betrayal in the House of Hayes. But for Rosa, there was no triumph. only peace. Eleanor's killers would spend their lives behind bars, but her justice had already been written long before the trial began. It was in her final act of clarity, in the quiet courage of a woman who refused to let evil win. And as Rosa walked away from the courthouse steps, she whispered to herself, "You did it, Eleanor. You won." When the trial ended, the world moved on. Headlines faded, cameras left the courthouse steps, and the story that had once dominated the evening news began to dissolve into memory. But for those who truly knew Eleanor Hayes, her legacy was only beginning. In the quiet weeks after the verdict, Rosa Martinez returned to the home she had served for more than 3 decades. The house felt different now. Emptier, yes, but lighter too. The heavy air of deceit that had once hung over its walls was gone. In its place was silence, the kind that felt sacred. Rosa stood in the kitchen where Eleanor had spent her final months, the same kitchen where Victor had stirred his poison. The tea set still sat on the counter, polished and unused. Rosa touched one of the cups, tracing her fingers along its rim. "You knew," she whispered softly. "You always knew." For days, she cleaned, packed, and sorted. There was no bitterness, only purpose. Each photograph, each letter, each possession told the story of a woman who had built everything through perseverance, and who, even in death, refused to let the darkness win. When the settlement from the life insurance finally came through, Rosa didn't keep a cent for herself. Instead, she walked into the same attorney's office where Eleanor had made her final change and placed the check on the table. "I want to establish a foundation," she said, "in her name, for women like her, for mothers who've given everything and have no one left to trust." And so, the Eleanor Hayes Foundation was born. Its mission was simple yet profound: to support single mothers, victims of emotional or financial manipulation, and women trapped in cycles of abuse. The foundation provided legal assistance, housing support, and small business grants, everything Eleanor herself had once fought to secure. Rosa worked tirelessly, guided by the strength of the woman who'd once believed in her when no one else did. What began as a single desk in a shared office space grew into a national network of support. Every program, every seminar, every scholarship carried Eleanor's name. In the first year alone, the foundation helped dozens of women rebuild their lives. Rosa made sure each recipient understood who made it possible. She wasn't perfect, Rosa would say, but she was good, and in the end, she made sure her goodness mattered. Meanwhile, Victor Hale rotted in a federal penitentiary. Reports from inside described him as cold and withdrawn, a man stripped of the charm that once gave him power. He rarely spoke, refused interviews, and spent most of his days alone in his cell. The guards said he kept a small newspaper clipping of Eleanor's obituary folded inside a Bible. Some claimed he read it every night. Lila Carter, serving her life sentence in a women's correctional facility, became a ghost of the woman she once was. She took up journaling in prison, pages upon pages of apologies, reflections, and pleas for forgiveness that would never be answered. In one of her final letters, she wrote, "I thought love meant being chosen. I never understood it meant being worthy. I see that now, but it's too late." She sent that letter to Rosa, who never replied, but kept it locked away in Eleanor's old writing desk. Journalist Dana Whitfield, whose articles helped bring the case to national attention, later published a book titled The Last Will of Eleanor Hayes. It chronicled not only the murder, but the life behind it. The woman who built an empire, loved deeply, and died with dignity. The book's final line became a phrase repeated by countless readers. Even in silence, she spoke louder than her killers ever could. Through time, Eleanor's story transformed from tragedy to testament. College lectures cited her case as an example of posthumous justice. Nonprofit leaders invoked her name when discussing financial autonomy for women. Survivors who had once felt voiceless found courage in the story of a woman who turned her final act into her ultimate victory. Every year on the anniversary of her death, Rosa would visit Eleanor's grave, a simple stone beneath a willow tree that read, "Eleanor Hayes, 1955 to 2022, she built her life. Then she built her justice." Rosa would bring fresh gardenias, Eleanor's favorite flower, and sit for hours, talking as if her friend could still hear her. She'd share updates from the foundation, letters from women they'd helped, and small moments of victory Eleanor would have loved. "Your name is everywhere now," Rosa would whisper. "You didn't just build a house, Eleanor. You built a legacy that can't be poisoned." And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all, that the very act meant to erase Eleanor Hayes from existence had instead made her immortal. The betrayal that was meant to destroy her had exposed the truth about greed, about trust, about how easily love can be twisted when it falls into the wrong hands. But it had also revealed something greater, that quiet courage can outlive cruelty. Eleanor's death didn't just end a life, it began a movement. A reminder that the most powerful form of revenge isn't rage, but resilience. And though she never lived to see it, her plan worked exactly as she intended. Victor lost his freedom. Lila lost her illusion. And Eleanor Hayes, the woman who built everything, gained something far greater than wealth or reputation. She gained vindication. Her story became a whispered legend in true crime circles, a haunting cautionary tale told in documentaries and late-night podcasts. But to those who truly understood, it wasn't just about betrayal or murder. It was about a woman who refused to be a victim, even when everyone around her conspired to make her one. Because Eleanor Hayes didn't just outsmart her killers, she transcended them. And as long as the foundation carried her name, her voice would never fade.